Well, to discuss all of this, I'm now joined by publisher and editor of Politics First, Marcus Papadopoulos. Marcus, why are we seeing this hype and anti-Russian sentiment, not just in the US, but of course in this country too?
Well, these allegations are completely unsubstantiated and are maliciously deceitful, and they're an attempt by the West to demonise Russia and to hold Russia responsible for all of the West's failings, both at home and abroad. And Senator Angus King did not put forward an ounce of evidence to support his assertions, and we have American mainstream media and British mainstream media reporting on his allegations as if they're gospel.
And yet, don't they see the way that those senators are so frustrated by the lack of information and evidence given by the people from Facebook and Google and whatever, Twitter?
Absolutely. But we always have to remind ourselves that mainstream media in America and Britain is neither independent nor reliable and is certainly not credible. Mainstream media in Britain and America is simply a weapon of the British and American establishments to target countries in the world which pursue an independent foreign policy and to try and discredit anyone, a politician or a journalist, who happens to think differently about a country, for example, Russia.
But of course, and they don't like the fact that, for example, you're talking about media being used as a weapon. RT is regarded as a weapon of propaganda for Russia. And I suppose you can understand that when people think, well, it's funded by the Kremlin. And immediately you see in the press, Kremlin-funded propaganda channel. No wonder people are going to be suspicious about that.
Well, RT is owned by the Russian government. Fact. BBC News is owned by the British government. Sky News, The Times, is owned by Rupert Murdoch. Look who owns CNN. Look who owns Fox News. These people have vested interests in trying to demonise Russia. We hear so much negative talk about RT and who owns RT, but no one in the West talks about who owns mainstream media in Britain and America. And the fact, Bill, is this. RT and Sputnik, for example, are targeted because they are exposing the reckless nature and the double standards of British and American foreign policy. The Americans and the British have failed in countries such as Libya, they have failed in Syria, and they have brought on this refugee crisis which is engulfing Europe and which has brought terrorists to the towns and cities across Britain and America. RT is exposing that. That's why the British and the American governments don't like RT.
Russia has a vested interest in seeing independence in Scotland, for example. I mean, we do have a base in Edinburgh, a news agency there, and now we're hearing suspicions about that coming from America about, obviously, Russia having a hand and involved in hacking and whatever, based in Scotland.
Yes, BBC News has an office in St. Petersburg and in Yekaterinburg. So what? Why shouldn't Sputnik, for example, or even RT, have an office in Edinburgh or, say, Manchester? There is no issue with that whatsoever. But as I said, none of these allegations have been substantiated. They are simply an attempt to demonise Russia, to demonise Russian media, because the British and the American governments feel threatened. They know the days of the 1990s when Western mainstream media ruled the field are over, and now they are feeling the heat of RT breathing down their necks.
What about this investigation, the Electoral Commission looking into interference, meddling over Brexit? We're about to see this hearing, and Boris Johnson, he's quite funny about it, really,
yes,
saying, not a sausage, and yet I haven't seen any evidence of this.
Well, I noticed that the Times newspaper and the Telegraph and the Sun haven't really made great play of what the Foreign Secretary has said. I wonder why, because that is going against what they want to believe. But let's just remind ourselves, the Sun newspaper, the Daily Telegraph and the Times, they're not serious publications. They're not intelligent publications. They're very, very spiteful. They're very, very poisonous. And let's not forget as well, the Sun newspaper once had a sister newspaper called The News of the World, which is now defunct, whose journalists hacked into the mobile phone of a dead teenager who had been murdered.
Do you think the British public, particularly when you're looking at a channel like this, will make up their own mind whether it's propaganda or not? And of course, we know for a fact that we're being monitored by the authorities, by Ofcom. So, particularly in news programmes, if we display any lack of impartiality, then of course we'll be caught out. So, but yet people still believe the spin we're getting from the media about this channel and another output from RT.
Look, I think it's a fact that most people in Britain do rely on British mainstream media for their information. But more and more British people are turning to alternative media outlets, for example, RT, for example, Sputnik. And we should really rejoice in that, because I remember the 1990s very well when, for example, the Americans and the British committed terrible crimes in the former Yugoslavia. There was no RT then to expose what the Americans and the British were doing.
The thing is, from many politicians, we're seeing Russia as the enemy at the moment. And as we started this conversation beforehand, can you explain exactly why there is this anti-Russian hype? Let's not forget about the news and RT and the rest of it, but why is Russia being under so much suspicion?
Well, on the one hand, Russophobia in Britain, for example, is historic. It has been in Whitehall and Westminster, embedded in Whitehall and Westminster for hundreds of years. On the other hand, we have to remember that the Russia of today is a very powerful country, and that is why the Americans and the British are targeting Russia so viciously as they are today, because they know that the hold that they had on the world in the 1990s is gone. They want a Russia of the 1990s when it was subservient to the West and when the Americans and the British could sideline Russia. That is not the case today, and that is why they are so furious with Russia.
Marcus Papadopoulos, thank you very much indeed for joining us here in the studio.